and online will have the opportunity to ask questions via the chat box. Ladies and gentlemen, housing is not just a commodity, but it is a fundamental right and a cornerstone of human dignity. Access to adequate and affordable housing should be a reality for all human beings. Instead, the world faces not just a housing crisis, but also an escalating crisis of eviction and displacement linked to a wide range of factors. Over the last years, the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing has developed guiding principles on resettlement, which have been presented in his final report to the Human Rights Council just this morning. During the interactive dialogue, we will now have an opportunity to dive deeper into the subject. Before we do that, a couple of words on the EU's perspective. The EU emphasizes that eviction, displacement, or resettlement must always be the last resort and be strictly compliant with international human rights and humanitarian law. Within the EU, a number of actions have been taken over the past year to advance the right to housing. Appointment of a first ever European Commissioner for Energy and Housing in late 2020 to lead the EU's response to the housing crisis. Launch of the first European Affordable Housing Plan last December after extensive stakeholder engagement and a public consultation gathering over 13,000 civil society inputs. It will be complemented in 2026 by a citizens' energy package aimed at delivering a just transition and eradicating poverty. I will now pass the floor to the panel. 3 of the speakers are with us here in person, 3 are online. There will be 1 round of interventions by the speakers, after which the floor will be open for questions, both from the room and online. I will introduce the speakers as I invite them to give their remarks. So first, I welcome very warmly Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal, the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. He is also Professor of Law and Development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As mentioned, his last report to the Human Rights Council contains his guiding principles on resettlement. Mr. Special Rapporteur, can you tell us a bit more about how these guiding principles came about and why you chose to develop a set of principles on this topic? Thank you so much.
And to guide us in today's discussion, I also want to thank warmly all the speakers who have agreed to join us, including, in particular, people joining online, our other 3 speakers, all distinguished voices, which are very important for this conversation. As you correctly said, evictions and displacement have been major concerns of the housing mandate since its creation. In fact, one could say that the reason why the housing mandate was created was because of a recognition by the Human Rights Commission at that time in 1993 that forced evictions are a gross violation of human rights. There was a resolution to that effect, and then it was followed by the appointment of an expert who was then succeeded by the first Special Rapporteur when that position was transformed to that of a Special Rapporteur in 2000. Since then, there have been 3 rapporteurs. I am the 4th, and will be succeeded by another one. But basically, the focus of the mandate has been on forced evictions. And I can tell you from my own experience, having sent 462 communications during the last 6 years, and hundreds more that I could not respond to because there is no time to respond to them, that a majority of the complaints that my office receives have to do with forced evictions. And so it's clear that this is a major concern. It continues to be an issue. But I recognize, as I engaged with these communities and I listened to these people, and I also listen to the states who deal with people who are displaced or moved for a variety of reasons, including increasingly reasons that have to do with climate change or issues that have to do with conflict. That in fact, it's very important to recognize that there is a wider problem, or there is another problem, let's put it that way, beyond just the act of eviction or displacement. Because if that is the first crisis, eviction or displacement is followed by a second crisis, which is the failure to resettle people who have been displaced. Unfortunately, there are too many instances where this is in fact the case, and people who have been displaced or evicted, they are simply forgotten very often, or they resettled with so poorly because of poor planning, poor financing, and other issues that they end up becoming worse off, often for generations. Their kids are worse off, for example, than their grandparents, and it just continues. It's like a cycle of poverty and destitution and of vulnerability. And when you look at more closely at who exactly bears the burden of these extra kinds of vulnerabilities, it all turns out that, again, it doesn't fall uniformly on everybody, but it falls more on vulnerable groups, whether it's single women-headed households, children, for example, older persons, ethnic, racial, and other minorities who are disproportionately displaced and evicted, but who are not resettled properly. So I saw two problems. One is that we need to tackle and put an end to forced evictions, as the Human Rights Council has called for decades now. But it happens too many times. But at least there is a normative recognition of the fact that evictions in particular, forced evictions, are against international law. But resettlement, on the other hand, the failure to take care of people who have already been evicted or increasingly displaced due to climate change, conflict, and other phenomena, there is really no legal framework. There is a normative gap. And the good practices, to the extent that they exist, come from informal guiding principles that exist, for example, within international organizations like the World Bank, like the Environmental and Social Safeguard number 5, things like that. They apply to development projects, but there isn't anything approaching that, for example, for climate change or conflict. So this is the reason why we have the guiding principles, and I presented it today. They are broad and universal. They apply to all contexts, not just development, but climate change, disasters, conflict, and even occupation. And basically rests on recognition of what I call as a trifecta of rights. People, first and foremost, have a right to remain where they are living. So resettlement, if it happens, has to be the very last option. And then secondly, that they have a right to return where it's possible, back to the lands and the houses that they used to live in. Sometimes it's possible, other times it's physically impossible. And then thirdly, that in case return is not possible, there should be a right to resettlement. And this right is then unpacked in the guiding principles in terms of both the broad framework obligations of states and other actors, international organizations, businesses, and non-state actors, but also operational obligation, more practical stuff that are important for making sure that the normative commitments can actually be implemented. So, for example, something simple like it's important to recognize as an operational obligation that states designate an authority that is responsible for resettlement. One of the big problems that you find in resettlement is that the responsibilities are dispersed across 6 different agencies, and every agency is pointing the finger at the other agency when it comes to explaining, why things are not the way they're supposed to be. So it's extremely important that there is a framework of implementation, and that's what the operational obligations in the principles are about. And I hope that this becomes really an opportunity for states and for judicial bodies, for national human rights institutions to use these principles actively in actual cases before them, actual projects that they're dealing with, actual needs for a variety of different purposes. And they're also taken up seriously by other actors. So in that way, I'm really very happy to see that we also have the Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, as well as others who have held senior positions, developing, pioneering other standards like this, especially the development of the 1998 guiding principles on internal displacement, including His Excellency Francis Deng himself joining us. And I'm really thrilled because the IDP guiding principles for me was like a model when it comes to drafting. if you look at the drafting of the principles, you'll see that it bears quite a lot of similarity in terms of format and approach to the 98 principles. It's in fact the only broad principle that applies to not just conflict, but development and at that time disasters. And after that, I want to say this is the only principle that applies to all situations of loss of home, dislocation, and so on. So I'm really glad that we're having these conversations, and I look forward to listening to this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur. You've made the transition very easy. So I have now the honor to turn to Mr. Francis Deng, who has joined us online, a diplomat, scholar, author, and South Sudan's first ambassador to the United Nations. From 1992 to 2004, Francis Deng served as the first representative of the UN Secretary General on IDPs, during which time he developed the already mentioned guiding principles on internal displacement. He later served as the special advisor on the prevention of genocide. So, Mr. Deng, building on your experience with the mandates on internal displacement and genocide prevention, in your view, how can human rights mechanisms most effectively cooperate with member states to promote and protect human rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to join you. Very impressive setting as I watch from here. Your question is very much to the point, and I will address it in a sense in a very broad, sweeping way, and then come to the focus on our mandates on internal displacement. I'm glad that Roberta Cohen is here, who was pivotal in convening a meeting or a team of experts to help us develop the guiding principles, and working closely with our chairman, who really was an excellent chairman, Walter Kalin, who unfortunately is not here with us. Let me give you just a personal background to how I got involved. Apart from a meeting that Roberta Cohen and colleagues in an NGO organized, a refugee NGO organized on internal displacement, in which I participated, I don't have much background on the issue. And then suddenly I got a phone call, a surprise phone call from our then Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, with whom I had worked closely when he was Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of his country, Egypt, and I was Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Sudan. And he called me to say, your name has come up for consideration for this position of Special Representative of the Secretary General on IDPs. And I'm delighted to appoint you. I said, well, this comes as a surprise. Could you tell me more about it? And then I'll get back to you. It's an honor, but let me get the details first. And he said, Francis, I know you well, and I know how concerned you are with these issues. This is not only a global crisis. It's one that affects our continent of Africa the most. And in Africa, it is your country of Sudan that is the worst hit. I can't see how you can say no. Let me say you have accepted. I'll tell them. If later on you have a question, we can discuss further. And of course, I then got to know how very sensitive the issue was. And I began to reflect on how to deal with very sensitive issue like this. And I got to know how the creation of the mandate itself was very controversial in the Commission. And appointing Representative Secretary General was a compromise. As I reflected on it, I thought one has to reconcile upholding the principles of human rights while at the same time finding a way of engaging governments to cooperate. It's very impressive, the broad consultations that the Special Representative or Rapporteur on Housing conducted and the sources consulted for the guiding principles. I'm not sure whether we have the same experience of the sensitivities of our mandates. So what I say is particular to the mandate of internal displacement, but might also be relevant to the mandate on resettlement. What I had to do was, in a state of governments becoming defensive in reaction to any allegations of human rights violations, How about defining the problem as first and foremost their national problem and responsibility, and our role is simply to help them help their own people. So on my country missions, the first 5 minutes with the head of state or the minister concerned were critical in saying that the problem of internal displacement, by definition, is internal and therefore falls under your sovereignty. I am respectful of sovereignty, but I don't see it negatively as a barricade against international involvement. I see it as a concept of responsibility of the state to protect and assist its own citizens. And if it needs help, call on the international community to help. Our role is here to help you discharge your responsibility. And then in a very subtle way, one has to add, but if your people are suffering and you are unable to protect them and assist them, as a result of which people in large numbers, are either dying or suffering, the world is not going to watch and do nothing. They'll find one way or another of getting involved. So the best way to protect your sovereignty is to discharge your responsibility with the help of the international community. I think this approach was more winning than simply be seen as upholding the principles of human rights as a basis for, in a sense, scrutinizing and maybe finger pointing at violations, which makes government become simply defensive. It is paradoxical because human rights are universal by definition based on the dignity of the human being, but because it is seen as an intrusive violation of sovereignty, governments tend to be defensive. So the challenge was to how to turn this into a framework of cooperation to help the people who need help. Otherwise, you simply just uphold the principles and be seen as though you're shouting from the mountaintop, while the people who really need help are there suffering. Now, when I would go on missions, and these 5 minutes would gain the support of the governments, I would then go to the affected communities. And after consulting with them, ask them the question, what do you want me to take to your leaders about your conditions and what they should do? In virtually all the countries I went to, around the world literally, the message was the same. These people did not see themselves as treated as citizens equal to the others and having rights to be respected. One person said, to this government, we are not citizens, we are criminals, and our only crime is that we are poor. Another said, none of our people is in that government. A third prime minister said, the food you're giving to those people, his displaced people, is hurting my soldiers. So the fundamental principle then was how to win them, to create a framework of inclusivity, equality, and dignity for all without discrimination. Now, the guiding principles themselves were somewhat sensitive. Some people did not want the concept of legal rights, partly because they believe rights already existed, and this would undermine what exists. Others said normative principle itself implies legal and therefore rejected. They asked for an appropriate framework. So our legal team, which Roberta will elaborate, had to deal with the framework of prevention, which itself was somewhat sensitive and controversial, because our legal experts said dealing with prevention is rather difficult. We deal with protecting those who are already displaced. But eventually we agreed prevention, protection during displacement, assistance, and solutions that go back. It becomes somewhat circular. So we had a team chaired by a very able Walter Kalin as chairman to develop over a period of engagement with broad consultations with different sources. And we decided that rather than talk about a legally binding instrument, let us develop guiding principles and the details of how that was developed and promoted and eventually taken note of by the Commission. We avoided asking for formal adoption, became taking note of. And we used that then as a basis for engaging governments. And frankly, I believe we won the cooperation of government. Some governments were still very negative on, the issue of internal displacement as a potential threat to national sovereignty. By and large, it was taken note of by the interagency committee, which was the first to adopt them, then by the refugee, the High Commissioner for Refugees. Ultimately, we use it around the country, around the world, as a basis for engaging governments. By and large, we succeeded. A couple of anecdotes, because my time is over. In one country, a very burly foreign minister, or rather actually minister for internal affairs, who was very antagonistic to the involvement of the international community, began to talk about our dignity. We will not allow foreigners to come and engage us. And I listened to this very aggressive, very confrontational attitude. Then I made the point, Mr. Minister, as an African myself, he was an African. I agree with you about, dignity and pride and all that of the African, but it has to be inclusive. You cannot be proud as an African dealing only with a faction while others feel excluded and denigrated. And in quite a number of other countries, I went to a country where they were fighting rebels and they saw internal displacement and the mandate as intrusive, thinking about the security of the country. Ultimately, after a long discussion, he said, Mr. Deng, I can see you are a missionary, and became very cooperative. And I had a series of country missions where, in fact, our country team in those countries who were very sensitive about the concerns of the governments and wanting the cooperation of governments on other issues, did not even want me to visit. And when I visited, we're delighted to see that governments were cooperative. So let me end by saying there's a bit of a paradox in upholding the universality of human rights, but also confronting the defensiveness of governments. And therefore, we have to find a way of defining the problem as a problem, not as just violations of human rights by governments, and to win the cooperation of government to do what is actually their responsibility. So the concept of sovereignty as responsibility became our normative framework. And I will stop here and leave the rest to my colleague, Roberta Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for these very valuable insights and for reminding us of this important concept, sovereignty as responsibility. Still very valuable and necessary to repeat these times. Now, allow me to welcome to us Alexandra Xantaki, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, and a leading expert in this field. She has published on cultural rights of minorities and indigenous peoples, cultural diversity, cultural heritage, balancing cultural right with other rights and interests, and the multicultural aspects of international human rights law. So to you, a question on, in your experience, how does the issue of resettlement come into play in matters of cultural rights, and how can these guiding principles improve human rights outcomes? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And, these guiding principles are very important, not least because they gather together things that may exist in other instruments. So, we can have everything together in one, under one instrument, but also because it clarifies some issues and fills some gaps that Raj was talking about. I'm very glad to see that Raj also made the connection, the guiding principles make the connection between the resettlement and cultural rights. And I think that the impact of resettlement to cultural rights goes far, far beyond cultural heritage. May I remind you that when we talk about cultural rights, we talk about the right of groups to and individuals to express their humanity, worldviews, and the meanings they attribute to their existence. And very often this meaning that they attribute to their existence is very much connected to their natural environment and their surroundings. And it includes cultural rights, includes the languages, but also sciences that are related to the flora and fauna in their in where they live. The sciences that they develop through that, their knowledge, convictions, religions and beliefs, sports and games, rites and ceremonies, production methods, technology and livelihood. So all of these, food and ways of life. So all of these are very much related to the environments in which individuals and communities are, and they're very much influenced by that. So, but even more than the technicalities, moving home means a big change in the psyche, in the soul of a lot of us, and even more so of specific communities that have this very close connection with the environment. So it changes, it affects the identity of everyone, and in this respect, states have to be extremely careful, and resettlement has to be a rarity. And I think that this has been forgotten in the past, because resettlement focuses on physical loss, so loss of the home, loss of other income, etc., and it fails to see the deep impact on one's identity. I'm very happy to see that Raj, the guiding principles talk about the right to remain and restrictions to the right to remain. And the restrictions, legality, legitimacy, proportionality, are not often taken into account, and especially the issue of legitimacy. So there are, the legitimate reasons that somebody can be relocated, resettled, and also the issue of proportionality is not really discussed, and I'm happy to see that. But for me, I think the core of the issue is always participation. And, through my mandate, I always emphasize participation. So the participation of these individuals and also people, and this reflection of where they're going and whether they have been asked whether they want to leave or not. So first of all, is it necessary for them? Are there any other ways that resettlement can be avoided? And if not, what is their view and what is their opinion? And I think that, it is very important that we have here, we talk about meaningful participation when it comes to individuals, effective participation when it comes to minorities, and free, prior and informed consent when it comes to indigenous peoples and local populations. This interplay between individual participation and collective participation, free, prior and informed consent, sometimes needs balancing and needs to be discussed further. And it's still a very topical issue. And finally, what I really liked is this paragraph on the donor's responsibility. And I think that, donors are only too happy to say very often that it is up to the country rather than to us. But, projects have to pause if resettlement is not done with the principles that are enumerated in the guiding principles. And I think that, it's time to talk very clearly about the responsibility of the donors in this respect. So very helpful, these guiding principles, and I thank the mandate a lot for managing to get them out.
Thank you so very much for these remarks. Some common themes also between the presentations appear. So now we are turning to our fourth speaker, Mr. Vincent Chetaille, who is Professor of International Law and Director of the Global Migration Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute, an internationally recognized authority on migration, displacement, and refugee protection. He regularly serves as a consultant and advisor to governments, NGOs, and international organizations. The question to you is, based on your experience, how will the guiding principles on resettlement complement existing frameworks in international human rights law, refugee law, and international humanitarian law when it comes to durable solutions? And where do you see the main added value?
Thank you very much. This is a great pleasure to be here with you, and thank you very much for the invitation. There are obviously broad questions as such, and you hear me? Yeah. And in a few minutes, it is obviously quite a challenge, especially for law professor. But clearly, the guiding principles are part of a broad and rich normative ecosystem, and they are supplementing, clarifying, contextualizing, and reinforcing many existing rules and framework as such, and to in a quite considerable extent. So I will just give some examples. To start, obviously, with international human rights law, the principles normative foundation is obviously Article 11 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And from this angle, what is interesting is that the principles incorporate the Committee 7 criteria for housing adequacy and applies them as benchmark for any resettlement outcome. So interestingly, for the very first time in a universal soft law instrument, the adequacy criteria are operationalized procedurally. So this is quite something. This is not simply a general standard as such. So this is an important element. When it comes to humanitarian law, the relations to international humanitarian law is also a quite significant aspect of these principles. The commentary on the accountability explicitly reminds that forced displacement may constitute a war crime and a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute, notably, and this is an important reminder per se. The invocation of Common Article 3 as a basis for non-state actors' obligation is also important because it is anchoring the principle into universally binding treaty law, and this is important for a soft law instrument. A more, let's say, progressive development, I found very interesting the notion of domicile, which is particularly important, especially since a few years in different parts of the world. And clearly, this is something which is important from the angle of international criminal law. And obviously, the principles, IHL is not indifferent to this issue, but IHL is perhaps quite general in its protective instincts, whereas the principles provide more substantive rights-based framework. And clearly, I see a complementarity and see a continuum between the general provision of IHL and the much more operationalized provision of the principles as such. Regarding refugee law, because you ask human rights law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. Interestingly, the principles also do a reference to the Pinero principles on housing and property restitutions of refugees and displaced persons. So it does acknowledge these important software instruments. It extends the reparation framework, and I found this important in the sense that the guiding principle established not only restitution and compensation, but in fact the full panoply of reparation. So I think this is bringing something as such. And obviously for refugee specifically, for refugee law specifically, of course, the complementarity is quite obvious here because the Geneva Convention and its protocol define with the refugee, thus provide no refoulement, but they are not explicit at all when it comes to housing resettlement for typically after voluntary return as such. And I think that here, this is an important contribution because it does reaffirm adequate housing with security of tenures or fair compensation as an important element as such. So among many other examples, simply to give you some example as such, more generally, I found an important added value in the universal scope of application. And this is probably the most fundamental value in the principles, because it's the universal scope across all causes of displacement. Because so far, existing instruments are focusing on specific cause, refugee and persecution, internal displacement. Here, we have a transversal approach covering both internal and external displacement. So I found this particularly important as such. Obviously, operationalizing the right to adequate housing as a durable solution is clearly important as such, because prior frameworks were not clear as it is when it comes to housing and a durable solution as such. So I think this is, and obviously the number of addresses also. Yeah. The multi-actor obligations is clearly, I mean, a graphic illustration of the added value, because the principles are detailing obligation on 4 distinctive categories: states, international organizations, businesses, and non-state actors. And I think this is important, obviously not fundamentally new, but still important to clarify the existing legal regime. And also the right to remain, which was also mentioned, is an important, quite important as a primary standard, is a quite innovative and important element. I don't want to develop because it has been mentioned just before. So overall, many intriguing, important issues, and obviously these software instruments shall work in tandem with abiding instruments in order to make all these aspiration into legally binding commitments. So to conclude, these guiding principles represent what we can see as the most important advance in the normative architecture of displacement law, since obviously the guiding principles on internal displacement. And like the previous guiding principles, the main contribution is not in the creation of your rights. The main contribution is the synthesis, the operationalization, and the contextualization of these existing rights into a coherent and life cycle framework applicable across all causes of displacement. And clearly, if this instrument is taken seriously by states and others, it can fundamentally alter and improve the life reality of many in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for unpacking the principles and giving us some sort of a navigation aid. So allow me to turn back to the virtual room now. I welcome Mrs. Roberta Cohen, a specialist in human rights, humanitarian and refugee issues. She was a leading voice in advancing awareness on IDPs and the guiding principles on internal displacement. She served at the UN, the US State Department, and NGOs, and the Brookings Institution, where she co-founded and co-directed a project on international displacement with Mr. Deng, serving also as his senior advisor and to his successor, Walter Kehlin. The question to you is, based on your experience with the guiding principles on internal displacement, what steps would you consider most effective to promote implementation of the guiding principles of resettlement? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to set forth some of the strategies that we used to promote implementation of the guiding principles on internal displacement. I want to note again that I served as co-director of the Brookings Institution project on internal displacement, together with both representatives of the Secretary General, Francis Deng and Walter Kehlin. That arrangement, a think tank working together with a UN mandate, added expert staff, ideas, and resources to the mandate, and enabled it to undertake programs around the world that it could not otherwise have done. I recommend an innovative institutional arrangement. Second, we relied on a broad-based process to develop the principles, which Special Rapporteur Rajagopal also did. The process not only enriched the document, but promoted shared ownership of the principles by the different UN agencies and NGOs consulted. Thus, OCHA printed 10,000 copies of the principles, which it circulated as soon as the Commission took note of them. UNHCR sent them out to their country teams for application, and the UN operational agencies spoke up at the Commission, influencing member states to accept them. The Brookings Project also developed handbooks for UN staff and NGOs on how to use the principles in the field, which proved valuable for programs and discourse. Third, we found it important to regularly reiterate that the principles developed were consistent with international law. Our lawyers developed extensive compilations, analyses, and annotations to show exactly how the principles were derived from human rights, humanitarian, and refugee law, and to what situations they applied. This reassured states and enhanced standing and authority of the principles. It took time. There had to be negotiations. But by 2005, a broad acceptance developed. The World Summit Outcome document recognized the principles as an important international framework for the protection of IDPs. Fourth, we gave special attention to the role regional and sub-regional organizations can play. We organized seminars with these bodies in Africa, the Americas, and Europe, which increased awareness of and support for the principles. The OAS and the OSCE adopted supportive resolutions, and the African Union developed and adopted a legally binding treaty based on the principles, which came into force in 2012. Fifth, the two representatives of the Secretary General on their missions brought the principles to the attention of heads of state and leading government officials. And some 40 countries adopted policies and laws based on them. However, to achieve effective policies and laws at the national level, monitoring machinery needs to be included, and best practices from other countries should be shared with those drafting new instruments. We also found it useful to be in contact with local authorities, because we discovered that it is often local regulations that have to be adjusted. National human rights institutions can also be helpful in promoting usage of the principles. Engaging development banks and institutions can help link laws and policies to national development plans. Lastly, but not least, creating alliances with civil society and those affected is absolutely essential. We reached out to local NGOs, academics, lawyers, women's groups, and the internally displaced and their representatives. We organized national seminars to bring these actors together, sometimes for the first time. And we supported local groups, translating the principles into local languages and training IDP associations on how to use them. I remember IDP representatives in Sri Lanka using the principles to advocate with camp commanders for better conditions. I remember lawyers in Georgia who analyzed their own laws in light of the principles and then pressed their government successfully to improve those laws. In Colombia, where civil society was highly active, the Constitutional Court cited the principles and then ordered the government to increase material aid to IDPs. In India, a group of academics used the principles as a monitoring tool to measure conditions in the state of Assam, and the state government in response announced cash compensation for each IDP family. In sum, the principles are not just a piece of paper. but a document that can come alive, be empowering, and improve conditions. I hope you will make the resettlement principles into a widely used and recognized instrument that helps those who are forcibly evicted and displaced. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these very valuable insights and practical recommendations. So last but not least, I recognize Mr. James Gachil, who also joined us online. He is Chair in International Law and Professor of Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. He teaches and writes in areas of international law, international human rights law, and international investment law from a critical perspective. As a former vice president of the American Society of International Law, he serves or has served on various editorial boards of journals as well. So to you as a last speaker on the panel, it feels natural to ask whether based on your expertise, you see any remaining gaps that the guiding principles on resettlement do address directly. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this event to witness the launch of these guiding principles that the Special Rapporteur has been working on for the last couple of years. Before answering your question, and in fact, it was hard to find any gaps, let me say a word or two, perhaps repeating some of the things that have already been said, perhaps also reflecting the importance of these guiding principles. I would like to first to congratulate the Special Rapporteur on these guiding principles. I think we can all agree that he has done some courageous work, some work that is very timely, some work that is also very pioneering, as we have already heard, which also builds on previous work. The context in which the Special Rapporteur performed his work has been difficult, as we have all witnessed the breakdown of the rules-based international legal order, which continues to be under assault as we speak. And I think that these guiding principles provide some hope that rules of law, that international law can provide for those in the circumstances. As our last speaker has just alluded to, these guiding principles are not just words on a piece of paper, and I think that's very true. There are, as we've already had, some very important contributions in consolidating and in clarifying the obligations of states and the responsibilities of non-state actors and businesses and international organizations that these guiding principles tell us in the context of displacements, evictions, and relocations. As one of the speakers has already said, and I want to repeat and emphasize this, I think one of the pioneering and very courageous aspects of these guiding principles is inaugurating an entirely new principle of international law, domicile, which involves the massive violations of the right to housing that we have seen as the guiding principles and reports of the Special Rapporteur has told us the unprecedented levels of attacks, bombings, shellings, bulldozing of homes and civilian infrastructure without sufficient proportionality, necessity, and distinction. And this we have witnessed in Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, Myanmar, Sudan, the Syrian Republic, Ukraine, and beyond. In my view, this is one of the most important human rights issues of the current moment, and I think we should applaud the Special Rapporteur for bringing particular attention to it. The guiding principles are also important because of their cross-cutting nature with other related rights. For example, domicile is related to the right to voluntary, safe, and dignified return, reflected in the guiding principle 3.5, but also to the right of return enshrined in the ICCPR Article 12.4, under which individuals cannot be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter their own country. Further, under international criminal law, as we already have had, preventing return specifically through mass forced transfers or deportation, is considered a crime against humanity. By elaborating on related rights with regard to resettlement, the right to fair and adequate compensation, the right to reparation, the right to information, the right to meaningfully participate in consultations, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, the right to fair and equitable benefit sharing, the right to speedy and effective sharing, and the right against retaliation, the guiding principles are really important. I do international investment law. I see it as an arbitrator. I can tell you these are all very important principles and rules in international investment law, and they are no less important in this context. And I really applaud the Special Rapporteur in carefully elaborating all of these obligations. I think the GP is also timely because I know many national and international court judges that I study and work with in Africa and beyond will find them very accessible and useful. I mean, as you all perhaps know, within the African human rights system, both at the sub-regional courts, but also in the African Court on Human and People's Rights, guiding principles have been an important inspiration in interpreting human rights treaties like the African Charter. And these guiding principles, in my view, will be not any different. So I see these judges and the civil society groups that will bring cases before these courts at the national and international level and the regional levels as elaborating on them and therefore reinforcing them. And in my view, these guiding principles will give further content to the right to housing and help to fortify and to reinforce it under domestic law, but also under regional human rights systems. I'll come back to the regional human rights system in a minute. In terms of timeliness, I applaud the Special Rapporteur for paying particular attention to the dangers of forced evictions arising from green grabbing, another area that I have done a lot of work on, and what he calls climate gentrification. This is recognized in guiding principle number 1.2D. This is a really important issue. Recently, the Ogiek and indigenous community in Kenya were recently violently evicted from their homes, notwithstanding various decisions of the African human rights system. Their homes were razed to the ground by government forces, all to make way for carbon credit market investors. Many African countries are leasing hundreds of thousands of acres that are allowing high-emitting countries to offload their historical ecological responsibilities on the global south, while facilitating the forced evictions of people like the Ogiek communities from their homes without any plans to resettle them. These guidelines will play a key role in alerting governments not only to engage in such evictions and displacements in arbitrary and abusive ways, but also in productive ways about how to resolve those unfortunate situations that have occurred, and we hope they don't continue to occur. There is an excellent commentary on Guiding Principle 3 on rights of all persons evicted, displaced, or resettled. I know the Special Rapporteur could not have referred to all available international rules, guidelines, and soft law. The gap that I identify that I know will be filled in the application of the guidelines in practice is with reference to some of the adjacent regional frameworks. For example, I have in mind the Africa Union's guiding principles on large-scale land-based investments in Africa. Although those guiding principles do not focus on housing, they focus on what to do with regard to risks posed by the so-called new scramble for Africa's land resources. And they've been endorsed at the highest level of the African Union, the Summit of the Heads and State of Government in 2009. These guiding principles in particular focus on one aspect briefly mentioned in the guiding principles being launched today. That is the legitimate tenure rights accrued through prolonged occupation under customary, indigenous, and other sources of non-state law under Guiding Principle 3.1 of the guiding principles being launched today. The guiding principles on large-scale land-based investments in Africa elaborate on this further by requiring respect for human rights of communities including respecting customary land rights and compliance with the rule of law. They also require respect for the land rights of women and recognize their voice to generate meaningful opportunities alongside men and not to marginalize them further. I think developing some complementarity with adjacent regimes, such as those that I've just mentioned in Africa, is going to be important for these new guiding principles. And in fact, that's what we've had today with reference to those that were developed in the context of displaced people. So while I recognize the new guiding principles, reference the FAO's VGGTs, giving visibility to adjacent regional regimes, in my view, is equally important. Finally, let me say I was delighted that the new guiding principles outline extensive obligations of non-state actors. As we know, the question of whether non-state actors are bound by rules of international law is an intractable one. So it's really good to see the new guiding principles provide that non-state actors shall adhere to them in accordance with their legal status, capacities, and the degree of control they exercise. In providing that non-state actors shall adhere to the guiding principles as part of their responsibilities, the guiding principles continue to build towards and as well as to reinforce the growing and broad acceptance of the binding nature of human rights obligations like those in the guiding principles on non-state actors. So congratulations to the Special Rapporteur, and thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for pointing out also to some topical applications of the principles. So, dear participants, we are already out of time, formally speaking, but we have started with 7 or 8 minutes delay, so we can add this time to it. And if there are questions, I think we can take 1 or 2. So please, whoever wants to take the floor, yes, then please grab the mic, identify yourself, and if you have a question to a particular panelist, please also tell us to whom the question is directed. Thank you.
Thank you very sorry. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Antine Sonde. I'm from Burkina Faso. I belong to the nomadic pastoralist community, and it's very important for us as nomadic community talking about resettlement. And these principles are very important, but they are very important for us. We are going through a situation that is particularly difficult for us in the Sahel region, actually. While the world is focusing on the situation of Gaza, Palestine, Ukraine, the nomadic community in the Sahel region are facing unforced displacement in their countries. For example, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. My question is, where we have like this government who are not militaries that have taken over the power, how this principle will be respected for indigenous people? I'm nomadic community, because I'm asking the question to the Special Rapporteur. We need really the support of the Special Rapporteur to the implementation of these guiding principles for us, for our right to recognize our right in our countries, because this is the situation that we are living. No one is talking about our situation, unfortunately. We are going through a genocide. I'm sorry to say that. Every day, people have been killed in the Sahel region. No one is talking about what happened in Burkina Faso, because the authors, those who are doing that, is not only the non-state actors, but the government itself. That's happening because the principle can be implemented if the government is involved. But if they are the one who are violating the right of indigenous people, how this principle will be applied? Thank you. I'm sorry for my English.
Not at all. And thank you very much for the question. Before handing over to the Special Rapporteur, may I ask if there's any other question? Okay, we don't have anything in the chat box either. So please, I turn it over to you also for your concluding remarks, if you wish to combine and reply to this and a reaction to all the panelists.
Let me again express my very sincere gratitude to all the panelists I know some of you, like Professor Shettel, I heard came after just finishing your class. I don't know how you rushed over so fast, but I'm really grateful for our interlocutors joining virtually. It's never a good medium to join, but I hope this was a good conversation. I really am grateful. And I think it's important to just start with what Roberta Cohen said. It's not just a piece of paper. I think in two senses. One is that it already reflects the lived realities of people who are suffering the consequences of evictions and displacement and failure to resettle them. And on the other hand, they are also not just a piece of paper in another sense, in that they are the beginning of a demand for justice. The principles are simply a lived expression of a demand for justice. And how they get used, in fact, is more important than the fact that they have now been submitted in a paper form before the Human Rights Council. And there again, I take inspiration from the multiple examples that were given by Roberta and others, and also the opportunities for engaging with other legal regimes, including international investment law, perhaps in creative ways. And I hope that whether it's states or local governments or national human rights bodies or civil society groups and victims who are trying to assert their rights, like in Burkina Faso, and I agree, groups like nomadic groups are particularly challenged because of their more difficulty in establishing, for example, a habitual place of residence. And the absence of being able to establish that habitual place of residence or not being able to show property in a tangible form recognized under domestic legal systems leads to blind spots where they simply disappear. And this is not true just in Burkina Faso. And I hope that these realities lead to the actual use of these principles. And I'm finishing my mandate in May, but I hope to remain very engaged with the Human Rights Office of the UN and also with my successor, who will be appointed during this session, to continue the work on these and other principles, and hopefully we'll take some inspiration from the experience of the 1998 guiding principles, for which, once again, my very deep appreciation to His Excellency Francis Deng and the entire team led by Roberta Cohen and others. So thank you very much again for sharing this.
Well, thank you very much for your remarks, your wrap-up, and thanks to all the panelists for their excellent and complimentary, I think, very much and practical suggestions. This was really very interesting panel. And thank you to all the participants for staying with us and giving us so much attention. But before wrapping up or adjourning, I really would like to thank you, Rapporteur, as you were completing your mandate, and also recognize your great dedication, your excellent work, and your crucial contribution to advancing the right to adequate housing and the cause of human rights more broadly. So really very impressed by your work and performance. Thank you so very much. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.